All right, guys, this is Dr. Brian Mann coming at you from the University of Miami. If my computer ever uploads there, here we go. So here's some stuff that that I'm talking about right now in one of my courses, one of the master's courses. And here I'm using some of the NSCA material and some of my own. And real quick, I wanted to just do a quick little talk for you guys about training frequency. Training frequency is the number of training sessions completed in a given time period. For a resistance training program, a common time period is 1 week. Now, training status is how long you've been training, right? So, a training status affects the number of rest days needed between sessions. Sometimes it'll mean it's more. Sometimes it'll mean it's less. Now, frequency of 3 workouts per week is recommended for most athletes to allow sufficient recovery between sessions. Uh, More isn't always better. If the athlete can't recover and they go into overtraining, they've lost everything that they gained. And here's some basics. If a beginner has never trained before, they're going to get fantastic results from doing just 2 to 3 sessions a week. The intermediate, 3 to 4, and the advanced, 4 to 7. And realize that this also is talking about just their resistance training. Most college athletes are really beginner or intermediate as far as lifting goes because they're going to have large breaks that are away from resistance training as the priority. So realize that in college, you're never going to need to really go beyond 4 days. Now, are there some exceptions? Well, no, absolutely. But as just the general rule of thumb, the more isn't always better. It's about being recovered and being able to participate. The more highly resistance trained athletes can augment their training by using a split routine in which different muscle groups are trained on different days. So, going from the total body to dealing with higher intensities and higher volumes, which will necessitate a greater recovery period. And this is just some common split routines. We see the top 2 rows are your old school upper lower split. And then we see below are 2, common bodybuilding splits where, we've got chest, shoulders, and tris on day 1, lower body on day 2, back traps and bis on day 3. We see how they flip through for a 5-day rotation to where they get lower body in twice a week and upper body in 3 days a week. And then we see a different split where they're going, 7 days a week with 1 rest day, and they just repeat the chest and back, lower body, shoulders and arms, and just keep going through that again and again and again. Is one better than the other? Man, it's personal preference. I'll be honest with you. Sport season. So the seasonal demands of the sport may limit the time available for resistance training. In the off season, that's whenever we're typically training the most. And sometimes people don't understand that you can have an off-season season. So then that really isn't another off-season period, it's an in-season period. What do I mean by that? Well, fall sports like football or soccer or and a multitude of others, they have spring seasons to where they're going to have practice, competition, whether it's inter-squad or intra-squad. So they're going to be practicing, and you're going to have to reduce the training to match what their demands are. Preseason, that goes down to 3 to 4 because sport specific skills increasing. In season, 1 to 3, and postseason, which is an active rest, and oftentimes this is our anatomical adaptation phase. We're going 0 to 3. Now, athletes who train with maximal or near maximal loads require more recovery time before their next training session. The heavier the load, the more different systems are being taxed. The other training frequency is influenced by the overall amount of physical stress. We have to realize that stress is systemic. It doesn't matter what the source of the stress is. It's going to affect the body the same way, and we'll get to that here in a minute. Consider the effects of other aerobic or anaerobic training. What else are they doing? What sorts of conditioning are they doing? Are they doing on their own? Are you doing? Are the team leaders having everybody do? You have to take into account sport skill practice because, let's be honest, what matters most for the sport? It's the scoreboard. So we need to make sure that is doing well. Physically demanding occupations, it's nothing for a bunch of, and some of the places that I've worked, either at 1AA, now it's FCS, excuse me, or at Division One and even the big BCS schools, that there's going to be athletes that come from poor families, so they end up doing higher paying jobs that are physically demanding. Because they don't have a scholarship check, or that they need to stock up money for themselves or for the school year, or to send money home for the family on the times whenever they can make the money. And these physically demanding occupations, of course, they would affect training. If you were asking somebody to do lift weights for 8, 10, 12 hours a day, and then do a specific workout on top of that, you would be like, no, that's stupid. They're going to get hurt. They're going to be overtrained. Well, the body doesn't understand the difference between the physical demanding stress from their occupation and the physically demanding stress for the training. So we have to make adjustments. Now, here we're going to go through how stress is systemic. And this comes from a paper on the effects of academic stress on illness and injuries in Division I football. And this slide just shows us that injuries are basically could be linked to overtraining. Right? During training camp, which is a high physical stress, there was the most number of injuries per week. Then academic stress periods had the second, and a low academic stress period had the third. So, but this makes sense, right? The lowest amount of stress, we're going to have the lowest amount of injuries. Now, why is that? Why would this academic stress cause anything? Well, just as we had mentioned, stress is systemic. This is a study from Tenda Sivak and Bill Kramer, and it's the physiological readiness and resilience, the pillars of military preparedness. Tenda is a service person, and Dr. Sivak is a service person, and Dr. Kramer's son served as well, so they definitely have some interest there. But the physiological stress response is a temporary phenomenon which acts to prepare the neuroendocrine, musculoskeletal, and cardiovascular systems to respond appropriately to a stressful event. Through activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, HPA axis, glucocorticoids are synthesized and secreted at a higher rate from the adrenal cortex. Simultaneously, sympathetic nervous system, the SNS activation, results in increased secretion of catecholamines, epinephrine, from the adrenal medulla. Under normal healthy circumstances, the stressful signal terminates, and through a negative feedback mechanism, the glucocorticoid secretion drops, stimulation of the HPA axis decreases, while simultaneously the sympathetic nervous system activity and catecholamine secretion decrease, and homeostasis is restored. However, humans have the ability to ruminate. And there will be times that you can think of that you just think of a stressful situation and your heart starts beating faster. Maybe your palms start sweating. You get a feeling in the pit of your stomach. The hair on the back of your neck stands up. You're reliving that stressful experience. And that's one of the things about humans. And this is why the ability to rest and recover, the ability to stop and separate yourself from the stress is so important. Because otherwise the body never returns back to homeostasis. So on that first page, on the first slide that we talked about, that was from one of my papers, and one of the reviewers asked about position. Okay, they thought that the high versus low velocity impacts. We examined the data by the individual position and position groups, and no effect in our data was found. But then they asked about playing time, and I'm actually very, very thankful for this reviewer because it led us to go here. And wow, that is super light. It didn't show up like that earlier, but that's okay. If we look at A is, well, let's start at the top. So we did a hierarchical logistic regression. A was everybody, so it was 101. B were only the subjects that saw significant playing time. There was 46 of those. C are the subjects that did not play. And we can see that if we simply look at, okay, and somebody's typically asked, well, what about the other 4 people? So there's 51 that did not play, 46 that did, that's 97. All subjects is 101. Those remaining 4 were punters and kickers. who, for one, they're punters and kickers, but for two, they didn't actually meet the criteria. I believe we said something like 20 snaps a game or something like that on average for them to have played. Uh, and unless you're completely dominating or completely getting handled, a punter or kicker is not going to meet that criteria, so they were excluded from the subjects that played. HPS means high physical stress. HAS is high academic stress. LAS is low academic stress. So if we look at training camp versus a testing week, we go over to the p-value, we see there's no significant difference. So for the guys that played, they were just as likely to get hurt from during a test week as they were during training camp. Now I need to go back and mention that this is a previous version of NCAA training camps. It's not how it is now, where it's 2-1 off, 2-1 off, 2-1 off. These were multiple two-a-days in a row. If we look at the training camp towards a normal academic week, we see that the athletes are 2.84 times as likely to get hurt, and that was a significant difference. We look at the high academic stress, the test week, and they're actually 3.19 times as likely to get hurt as they were during the normal week. So a test, a project week, they were 3.19 times likely to get hurt, and they were only 2.84. Now, again, did you notice that on B? Now, whenever I first saw this, that made my absolute jaw drop and my eyes bug out of my head and my tongue wag. I was like, holy cow, look at this. Those who played were more likely to be injured during a test week than during training camp. And this is a coach who understands that athletes are going to get hurt during training camp because he wants to do a lot of contact. But at test week, they were more likely to get hurt. 3.19 versus 2.84. There's a playwright who said, his name was Edward Bulwer Lytton, and the historical play was called Cardinal Richelieu. And in there he said, the pen is mightier than the sword. And while he was referring to politics at that time, it looks like he's correct here as well. The pen was more likely to hurt a person who was a starter than a 300-pound dude crashing down on them as hard as they could. Why is that? Well, additional stressors, guys. Being a starter is a stressor in and of itself. We see that from Petrie, 1993. There's a lot of stress to perform. There's internal stressors that the athlete puts on themselves. There's external stressors from the coach, their teammates, the media, their friends, the fans, social media. Now, we also have to pay attention to these outside stressors, what might happen in sport. In a study from Moore and Fry, a non-functional overreaching during off-season training for skill position players in collegiate American football, they had 3 phases. They had the weight training only, the weight training and morning conditioning, sometimes called county fair, winning edge program, mat drills, etc. Then they had a week of spring break, a week of light conditioning, and 4 weeks of spring football. So what happened? Well, their mean intensity for phase 1 and 2 just kept going up, tapered down a little bit, and then they tested. Let's look at during spring football. What did their training look like? Well, they went in helmet and shorts for a total of 4 hours and 23 minutes over that period. Full pads in 14 hours. Half pads for 3 hours. We look at the coefficient of variation for volume load. We typically want a standard 10%, and we see, phase 1, okay, they had a big week there. But phase 2, look at that coefficient of variation. It's all over the place. It's over 10%, quite a bit, and in some periods, more than double 10%. So what would we expect to see happen there is inner non-functional overtraining, which is essentially what we see. Test 1, test 2, 3, and 4. On average, the team scored 4.8 on their 40-yard dash. This number going up isn't a good thing. See, numbers going up in a 40-yard dash mean that they get slower. So at the end of phase 2, after that overtraining period, all right, they were significantly slower. and they were still significantly slower at the end of phase 3. And at the end of phase 4, they were no longer significantly different, but what is it? It's still higher than phase 1. So essentially, the training where we, in a game that we say speed kills, through not backing off from the sport, and this is something that I need to bring up, is that a conversation with some of the authors. The strength coach wanted to do his thing. The sport coaches wanted to do their thing. Both thought they were right, and neither one would budge on the volume, which is why this coefficient of variation went up so high for the volume load. Now, what we see here is that, hey, man, they overtrained, they got slower. Let's look at their agility. Hey, man, they improved their agility significantly, and then they got slower. They lost some of those gains. Now, what does this mean? What does this tell us? Essentially, guys, this is telling us that if you don't pay attention to overall load, you cost yourself speed, agility, strength, power, all of those things. So we have to make sure that we are taking into account more things than just how many days a week are you resistance training. All the other stresses matter too. So if you want to know more, come join us at the U. We've got undergrad exercise physiology program, and we've got some strength conditioning related classes within that you'll take with me. Masters of Strength and Conditioning with myself and Dr. Brian Biagioli. We also are going to have online coaches education courses for continuing education units through the NSCA. That's coming very soon. It's in any day now. If you want more information about how to join us, sites.education.miami.edu. Hope to see you all down here in Miami, in Coral Gables, either in person or virtually. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time.